You know what you're getting in a historic district, and it does come with additional rules, but I would also argue it comes with additional benefits.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 45 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
Hello and welcome to Episode 8. Historic districts seem to be a hot-button issue lately across the country. There are various states where legislation is being proposed that would effectively weaken or eliminate historic districts, and the state of Michigan is one of them. I actually own rental property in Heritage Hill, which is right next door to downtown Grand Rapids, and being an owner of rental property in this historic district, I can tell you that it is a bit more expensive. And if you want to make changes to the exterior of your property, that can be a more time-consuming process as well. But do the benefits outweigh the costs? So to answer that question, I'm going to talk with Suzanne Schulz today. Suzanne is the Managing Director of Design, Development, and Community Engagement for the City of Grand Rapids. That's her long title. Her short title is Planning Director. Suzanne, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Could you just start by telling us what a historic district is, how it's governed?
In the state of Michigan, a historic district is an area that has been designated by the local unit of government as worthy of protection. And what that means is that the local unit of government has adopted an ordinance for historic districts that follows state law, which defines the boundary of the area, and has had a study done of the neighborhood or the business district that tells why it's important from a historical standpoint. Why is it relevant and important that it merits protection? Once that's done...
Well, let me interrupt.
Yep.
So give me some examples of why a neighborhood might be worthy of being a historic district.
Sure. We have a couple of different examples in Grand Rapids. So, for example, the Heritage Hill neighborhood was our first historic district. It actually led to the creation of the statewide act that we have today. 2/3 of Heritage Hill was proposed to be demolished as part of urban renewal. So, Grand Rapids Community College, St. Mary's campus was supposed to expand and take down a lot of those old homes. I think the community recognized at that time that there was value in those structures. There was something that created the fabric of the community with the lumber baron mansions and the context of the neighborhood. And especially after losing City Hall, which had been a really notable structure actually designed by Elijah Myers, who's the same person who designed our state capitol. The community was really attuned to, we need to think about our past and where we came from, the character of our community and what that represents for us. But also, you can't build these kind of homes anymore. So starting with Heritage Hill, that really became part of that discussion and led to preservation of that neighborhood. More recent examples are like the Fairmount Square neighborhood in East Hills, where you have the older homes, but they're not quite as stately as you'd think of as a Heritage Hill home. And in that case, the neighborhood realized that it was a way to protect property investments, that neighbors, when they're buying into a historic district, that it has a brand to it. And that you know that the development that's happening in the neighborhood or improvements people are making to their property are consistent with the character of the neighborhood. And so for East Hills, they were looking at it from a standpoint of stabilizing the neighborhood, trying to make it attractive for people who wanted to invest in that neighborhood, who would have some predictability for that investment, that they knew what they were getting and what they could expect in return. And that overall, with that stability that they aim for, it reduces crime, improves safety, improves property values, provides some level of stability and security that we haven't seen be as an effective, that it's been very difficult in other neighborhoods to find that without district preservation.
Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about older homes, I mean, these aren't just old ramshackle houses that are ready to be torn down. How would you describe them?
It really depends on the neighborhood and the value of it. If you look at the Wealthy Heights neighborhood just north of Wealthy Street, it's worker housing. It was, I think a lot of people would look at the housing there and say, is that really worthy of preservation? I don't even know if there's a bathroom on the ground floor. So it kind of depends on the purpose of the district, on the homes that were created during that time. So it doesn't have to be a mansion built by lumber barons. It can be a really modest home, but that speaks to the history of the community and the creation of the community. We have neighborhoods that were built around furniture factories, and that speaks to the history of the city. So is that something that we need to think about preserving? Now, having said, the benefit of historic districts, that it's very uncommon. We only have 6 districts in the city of Grand Rapids. So it's not like these are all over the place, and they're not easy to create. We've had neighborhoods in the past look at creating a district and being designated. And as they go through the process and they talk to the neighbors, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they want to live under, a little bit more stringent set of rules that historic districts have for improving property. And in some cases, neighborhoods say, no, we really don't want that. And in other cases, we've had people say yes. But it really is not a common thing when you think of the legislation's been in place for 40 years, and we only have 6 districts in the city. And statewide, there's about 78 districts. So it's not a huge number, but it has been a very effective policy tool over time to stabilize urban centers.
Yeah, I know I live in East Grand Rapids, and a couple of years ago, we went through this same conversation. There's a stretch of streets in the East Grand Rapids area that are very nice, historical significance, and a group wanted to create a historic district, but there was a more vocal group who didn't want to create a historical district, and we went through that process.
Yeah, it is really, there is a defined process, and it's part of the public process. It's part of policy making. You have to have that debate. There's public hearings involved. The study committee has to be involved to determine even if it merits preservation. So it's a pretty rigorous process. And, in East Grand Rapids, you could argue the process worked because there are no historic districts. So that's there is a process to create it. And once they're created, there's a process, if you ever wanted to get rid of one, that you have to follow too. So it's not like it's permanent forever unless the community says, we're really going to look at kind of unregulating or changing the historic districts. There are procedures in the state law that do allow for that.
And let's talk about state law and just how historic districts are governed, because I know there's federal guidelines, and I'm sure there's state guidelines, and then local guidelines. So can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, the current state law refers to the Secretary of Interior standards, which is put out by the National Park Service. The Secretary of Interior standards are written rather broadly. And they're for rehabilitation, redevelopment. There's different standards depending on what you're addressing within a structure or a site. Those standards that the state refers to are then applied locally, and local units of government, specifically historic preservation commissions or historic districts. There's different sometimes names for those. And in Grand Rapids, it's Historic Preservation Commission. They rely on those standards in their decision making, but there's also kind of a notice to proceed path that takes into consideration unusual circumstances. So it's not always one size fits all. There's flexibility built into those standards. They're written rather loosely on purpose because you've got to look at every property and every situation on its own merits. So you have to take that into consideration. The notice to proceed has been a tool that we've been recently using. For example, at the corner of Division and Weston in the Hartside neighborhood, there were the 2 buildings, if people are familiar with 35 and 41 Division, they were kind of falling in on themselves just south of Fulton Street. And those buildings were demolished because they were unsafe. And we had a developer come in and ask for a 12-story building. Most of the buildings in that area are in the 5-story, 3 to 5-story range. 12 stories is tall. But there's also an underground stream that runs through the site. And that stream really makes building very expensive. If you're going to put in the foundation, you're sinking it down to bedrock. There's a lot of unique considerations we have to take into account in looking at that particular site. And so the Historic Preservation Commission said, 12 stories is fine. So there is flexibility in those standards. Right now, statewide, everyone is supposed to be using Secretary of Interior standards. They can add to that, and they can have flexibility in their interpretation as they look at that. So it's not black and white. There's lots of shades of gray in how you apply those standards, just as you would with any policy or ordinance.
But it does seem like in the example you just gave, the decision was made at a local level. I mean,
yes.
And there was some give and take, I'm sure. Once the local people on the would it be the Historic Preservation Commission would make that decision?
Yeah, the Historic Preservation Commission is appointed by the City Commission. So they're an appointed body, just like the Planning Commission or Parking Commission or Board of Zoning Appeals. And they have terms that they serve. And so the City Commission can take them on or off, depending on their leisure. So, they are there representing the community. So it's people who live in the neighborhood, business owners, architects, engineers, craftsmen, people who work on these homes that are familiar with it. So we have kind of a mix. It depends on who's willing to serve and their commitment to it. It's they meet twice a month and kind of go through that. Currently, the state law has appeals of their decisions go to an arbitrator, a neutral arbitrator at the state level, free of charge, and then that gets sent to the Historic Review Board, which is at the state level. There is a push with new legislation to change that process so that appeals would be held locally rather than going to the neutral party arbitrator and to the Historic Review Board at the state level, but that it would be done at the local level for all those appeals. And the current bill as proposed would require that the legislative body of the jurisdiction hear those appeals. So that would mean the City Commission then would have to hear appeals of Historic Preservation Commission decisions. It's a little bit awkward because the Historic Preservation Commission is really an administrative body, and they're at the leisure of the City Commission. The City Commission passed the ordinance as the legislative body, so having them also hear appeals of rules that they made is a little strange and something that we are concerned about. We have other processes set in place, like a housing appeals board or a board of zoning appeals, where, again, it's a separate entity from the one that made the decision, but it's not the legislative body. It's not the City Commission. And we're concerned about the number of requests they might get, the number of issues they have to deal with already, that we're adding another thing to their plate, and whether or not they would really, how that process would work is very unclear.
And you're referring to the bill that's in Lansing right now?
Yeah, we have there's two bills that have been introduced, one at the House level, House Bill 5232, and the other at the Senate, Senate Bill 720. Okay. And so they're calling the Historic District Modernization Act to try to change some of the rules that currently we have for historic districts.
I do want to get into those bills because I know that those are floating around in Lansing right now. But let's back into it a little bit more.
Sure.
Just taking it to a property owner or a real estate investor level. What are some of the drawbacks to owning property in a historic district as far as the additional costs you might find?
I think it depends on what the improvement to the property is. We have a lot of people who say we need to replace the windows. What we found in a lot of cases that old windows are actually better than new windows because of the old growth wood. It's much more dense and much more stable than the new wood that you get out of windows if you're doing wood windows. And that single pane glass, if you put a storm on it, that can be a much cheaper repair or weatherizing technique than completely pulling out new windows and or old windows and putting new windows in. So there are some things when we look at does it cost more, does it cost less? There is kind of a lot of people out there who are experts in doing preservation that say some of the keeping the old is actually more green and more economical than it is by replacement. So there's that debate out there. The challenge that we've had, if you look at some of the more modern materials, for example, windows, if you look at the windows that were put in the 80s, for example, in a lot of homes, a lot of them have already expired in their useful life. They haven't lasted because the double panes, give, or there's a seal that cracks and breaks, and now the window isn't really any good anymore. And we're looking at homes that the windows have lasted over 100 years. So you have that debate about whether or not new is better. in some cases. In other instances, though, when we do have window replacement, the Historic District or the Historic Preservation Commission does look at that and say, if it's like for like, if you're replacing with new wood windows and it matches the existing, that's fine. Now, there usually is a greater cost than if you were just doing kind of a 1/1 and picking it up at Menards and doing vinyl. That is a big difference, but it also changes the character of the structure itself if you don't have the right window that's being put in. So we also look at the window size openings. So there might be unique window sizes that you have to have rather than just kind of the standard window, and then you're reframing the entire window to fit rather than just keeping it the way it is. So it's not saying that things can't change, but I think the challenge is to be thoughtful when doing rehab and restoration on a structure rather than making the assumption that new is better, because in a lot of cases that's not necessarily so. There is the maintenance aspect.
New might be less expensive at the time, but I think your point is that over a period of time, what's there already could be just as good.
It can be. So that's the investor question, right? Are you in it for the short term or the long term? If you're really in it for the short term and you're just trying to flip it and get quick money out of it, the inexpensive fix that you're not as concerned about the life of that fix may not play into it, versus you're going to hold the property for a long period of time. You know that, it's a little bit more money up front, but I don't have to think about it now for the next 2 decades. Everybody does that same thing, whether it's for good clothing or good shoes or, a house or a car, you get what you're paid for in some cases. But in a lot of cases in historic structures, you don't have to pay more. It's just doing it differently. And that's part of the education process, I think, when people understand buying a historic home doesn't necessarily mean you have to think about tearing everything out and putting all new in. It's not just because it's quaint and charming, but there's some really functional reasons why some of this stuff works better, or worked better 100 years ago than it does today.
Yeah, you put it much better than I did. I actually own property in Heritage Hill.
Okay.
So I have several properties that have the wood windows, and in one case, you're right, we put storms up, and that was very economical. It was very efficient, and it cost us less than it would to have replaced the windows.
Yeah.
On another, we have a building that has windows that were put in the 20s, and the original windows are still there. They're still holding up. Might be a little drafty, and we might, as we improve this building, we'll be going through and kind of resealing, fixing whatever broken or cracked windows we might have. What do you call it? Resealing,
glazing.
Doing all of that, improving the windows that are already there, will save us money over having to replace those windows.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the benefits of owning property in a historic area.
We have found the benefits to be huge. When we look at the stability of these neighborhoods, the recession, I think, was really telling. When we look throughout the city at the properties that lost value, that their assessments dropped, property assessments dropped, or the property values, home sales dropped. The homes in our historic districts barely fell at all. There was just a tiny increment of a little bit of drop, less than 5%, compared to other neighborhoods where you could see 25%, 40% loss in value. So from an investment standpoint, these homes are stable, and it's because of the neighborhood, that the people who choose to live in these districts and own property in these districts view them as an investment and have a passion, I think, for maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood, that they know that their investment's protected. So one of the issues that you might have in an unprotected neighborhood, a non-historic district neighborhood, is that you could have a homeowner or a landlord buy a house next to you. You might have paid $100,000 for your home. Somebody buys a property next to you, and the character of that home can be stripped. They could tear off the front porch. They could put up vinyl siding. They could change out the windows to different sizes. And as long as it meets building code, they're fine. So there's certain things that you can still do modifications to your property outside the district that you couldn't be able to do in the district. And I think that stability of a historic district provides people with that investment confidence that they know what they're getting and they have that predictability. Not unlike you would get from a condo association or a homeowners association. Those things did not exist when these neighborhoods were built. So this is just kind of, if you think of it in that way, a modified approach to a homeowners association or a condo association that regulates kind of that exterior of the home. We do not regulate color. There's a lot of misperceptions
So
about
if I
what we
wanna paint
regulate.
my property blue and gold or purple and pink,
Sure.
I can do that.
Fluorescent orange, have at it. You can paint it whatever color you want. And I think a lot of people, it's that education process about what does this cover, what does this mean, and what doesn't it mean. But again, when we look at even historic designation in the Fairmont Square neighborhood, when that neighborhood became designated as a historic district, the values of the neighborhood went up 12% in 1 year. So, it's, and because people know that brand, they know that neighborhood, they can call it, look at Cherry Street. The Cherry Street Business District has been very successful. And in fact, when we look across all of the city and in those neighborhoods where we've had the most private investment happening, where we've had the most new housing products developed, commercial investment with new businesses happening, they've been in historic districts. Wealthy Street, Cherry Street, Heritage Hill, East Hills, Hartside. These neighborhoods are the ones that, companies like Rockford Construction and CWD have been investing in heavily and have seen those returns. If they weren't, if they didn't have confidence, they wouldn't be putting their money there and building those structures and investing, and they are. And it's unlike other places that do not have that assignment. So we know that they work. And really, when we think about from a public policy standpoint, the magic of it is it's really at no public cost. There's really no public subsidy that goes into creating a historic district. We have a staff person that administers the ordinance, just like we do have staff people for the zoning ordinance. But it's one person. And when you look at the benefits that we get in property tax, in income tax, in reduced crime, which lowers the need for police officers to be on site. The Cherry Hill Historic District is a great example of that, where we had one block where over 3/4 of the property in 2 blocks were absentee owned, and it was known as that's the place you go buy crack. And today it's almost all owner occupied, and it has completely become one of the hottest places to buy.
And which district?
In Cherry Hill.
Cherry Hill.
Cherry Hill. Mm-hmm. So we know if it reduces crime, it reduces the need for calls for service for police departments. So from a community-wide perspective, there's a lot of economic benefits to it. It really, again, no public cost to do this because it's really investor and property owner driven, and with some oversight with some additional layer with the Historic Preservation Commission. But I would argue it's really not onerous given the benefits that are received.
From my perspective as a real estate investor, I own a number of properties in Heritage Hill. And the properties that I own that are in a historic district rent faster, and we get higher rents. And if I look at the improvement in value, the appreciation, it's been much more dramatic than properties I own outside of a historic district. So I can attest to that.
Well, good. No, we know. I mean, I think that's there's waiting lists for apartments right now. At Heritage Hill,
Yes.
It's interesting. The neighborhood association used to make money off of their rental listings. You used to be able to go to the association office and get a printout of all the apartments that were available in the neighborhood. And partly it's a shift to technology. People are using Craigslist or other ways to lease. But the demand is so hot that there's no point in printing the list anymore, because as soon as something becomes available, it's gone.
Really, I mean, if you look at why Grand Rapids is the number one in the nation for rentals, 98% occupancy or better, part of it could be because of these historic districts that generate that kind of enthusiasm among renters.
Well, and I think when you look at the location of these districts, Hartside and Heritage Hill in particular, most especially Midwest communities seem to have gutted the interior of their cities. So the near neighborhoods to downtown became parking lots, or large institutions expanded, which is really what our fate was supposed to be had it not been for the creation of Heritage Hill Historic District. That was the plan for CC and for St. Mary's expanding. And really, the whole donut around downtown was identified as a community renewal area with the thought that it would all be demolished over time. And when you look at successful urban centers now, and we're at the top of the list on a number of lists about being a successful city, it's, I think, in large part due to the proximity of Hartside and Heritage Hill and these other neighborhoods directly adjacent to downtown, that they weren't demolished, that they were preserved and have been continuously invested in. They have really stabilized the city and, in turn, the entire region. When you look at places like Flint or Saginaw or Detroit, it's not just the core of the downtown that suffers, the entire region suffers. And it has economic impacts that kind of, ripple across those regions. And to be able to have a very strong downtown core and strong neighborhoods benefits people in Kentwood and Wyoming and Walker and Grand Rapids Township, because then it's an attractive place to be. If you have family come in from out of town, you want to take them downtown. You want to show them what's happening, take them to great restaurants, go through a walk through Heritage Hill, experience the culture of the community, which I think is pretty unique compared to a lot of cities that have seen a lot of disinvestment and a lot of demolition.
Yeah, and every year Heritage Hill or the historic districts have a tour that brings over 3,000 people in from all over the country and some even international. That's because the seeds were planted in the 60s and 70s to preserve what we have here. Let's kind of switch gears and talk about the seeds that are being planted now. This bill, or these two bills in Washington, what are they, and what is kind of the thought process behind them?
The bills are for the state of Michigan, so I just want to make sure it's not in Washington, but they're state bills.
I said Washington. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Michigan.
I just want to make sure. So we've had the Historic Districts Act in place for over 40 years, and the recent proposals to amend the act, so House Bill 5232 and Senate Bill 720, seek to change kind of the procedures and processes under which historic districts kind of can be formed, how decisions are made, and kind of how you unravel some of this stuff. So there were previous versions. There was just a recently adopted or amended bill last week that took out two of the most onerous provisions. Those were requiring a citywide vote of every elector to determine whether or not a neighborhood could become a historic district. So that was removed. And then the other... So
a citywide vote of everybody, every voting person in the city would have to vote, and 2/3 of them would have to approve a historic district. Is that how it works?
There's another provision that 2/3 of the property owners in the district would have to agree. But the citywide vote of, can you or can't you create a historic district was eventually dropped, which was great because we felt, why would someone care who doesn't live in the historic district, what the fate of that neighborhood is? Or so it seemed awkward having the entire community decide for one neighborhood which should happen. The other one was a 10-year sunset that basically would eliminate historic districts after 10 years. And the only way to maintain them would be to have 2/3 of the property owners agree that they needed to stay in the district and have a citywide vote, which we thought was really unreasonable and would provide for a very unpredictable environment for property owners and investors, who are looking at that value of being in a historic district and having the unpredictability of not knowing what's going to happen, whether that status is going to be maintained after 6 years, for example, that it could go away and everything you thought you had would be changed. So that was also removed. What is still in the legislation is the 2/3 property owner consent, that 2/3 of the property owners in the proposed district would need to agree just to form a study committee, just to look at the possibility of considering becoming a historic district. The concern there is that you could have several property owners determining the fate of an entire, portion of our community. And in some cases, we have had that experience. Being in an urban environment, you'll have people who might own a whole block or own several blocks. And if you are the homeowner that isn't that person, you're next to the guy that owns 8 properties and you own your one property, you've made that investment. Does that give you the equal say, and what does that look like over time? And then also, does that put too much control when really the legislative body, the city commission, elected by the citizenry of the community, might be able to better determine whether or not there's historic merit, or if it's a structure or a neighborhood we're saving, that you could have a broader community discussion and not just leaving it to, you can't even study it unless 2/3 property owners agree. So that provision is still in there. Local appeals, so I mentioned that earlier. Right now, the appeals process is it goes to the state free of charge to a neutral arbitrator, and then it goes to the Historic Review Board, and that is proposed to change to the local level. While, from a Grand Rapids perspective, we're not necessarily opposed to having appeals at the local level, the current legislation proposes that the legislative body, which would be the city commission, only can hear those appeals. And because we're not sure if we would have an increase in appeals or what that process would be, that leaving that with the city commission is very challenging because of the number of items that they have to deal with on a regular basis, and having a hearing on an appeal for somebody who might have replaced an illegal window. If they replaced a window or did something to a porch, and they don't agree with the Historic Preservation Commission, is that really something that the City Commission's time should be spent on, or can they delegate that to another body? And we're suggesting that they delegate that to another body. The Secretary of Interior standards are another piece that that's currently mentioned in the state of Michigan law, and the proposal would be to kind of soften that language to allow communities to develop their own standards, which kind of the quote is in the best interest of the community versus following those standards. And the concern there for us would be whether that will lead to arbitrary decision-making, lack of uniformity across the state in decision-making, make it less transparent because you don't know who's determining what's in the best interest of the community, rather than following federally accepted standards. Seems to be kind of one of those question marks that we have on whether or not that's really kind of the right direction. If we want to have consistent decision-making across the state, you still get differences based on the membership in each historic district or historic commission. But, you have to have some sort of uniformity as well. And we have developers like Brookstone Capital and Bob Jacobson, who just recently did the 2 buildings across from the downtown urban market. And they do work throughout the state, and they look for historic districts to be in. And not having that consistency of similar standards from community to community, I think also makes it more difficult from a redevelopment standpoint of developers that are investing in Michigan, and that predictability and the approval environment that they need to be able to continue to do their work. So we have concerns about that. There's several other things in there I could get into, but those are some of the more substantial changes that we're looking at and trying to work with Representative Afandoulas on. And hopefully then that bill would then get passed to Senator McGregor, who's the sponsor in the Senate, to try to have those adjustments made.
Okay, so you're working with Representative Afandoulas? Mm-hmm. And help me get this straight in my head. Let's just do a checklist here, because you named a number of different provisions in the bill.
Yeah.
The first 2 really had to do with maintaining an existing historic district, and having to have kind of a consensus of the community as to every 10 years as to whether that could exist. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And have those been removed, or?
They were removed just last week, yes.
Oh, okay. Well,
so that was good. So that's progress.
So that's progress. So that goes to the immediate threat toward existing historic districts.
Correct.
Is there any language in the bill that still exists that threatens the survival of historic districts that are already in existence?
I think going forward, softening of the standards from an investment standpoint. If and again, it will depend on each local historic preservation commission and how they choose to handle that.
Softening of the standards, and then also the appeals process.
And the appeals process
of those standards as well.
Yes. So both the appeals process and modifying the standards would potentially impact current owners in historic districts.
And the two provisions that do still exist that threaten future historic districts, those are still in there.
Yes.
And it's requiring a greater consensus of the community to even study or instigate a historic district.
Yeah, the consensus has to be among the property owners, the 2/3 of the property owners. And then also what was added when the other two provisions we just talked about were removed, what was also added is that you need 2/3 vote of the legislative body. So you'd have to have 2/3 of property owners agree and 2/3 of the city commission agree just to study whether or not you should create a district.
Yeah, that's a pretty high bar to cross.
Well, the goals that we are told in the proposed modifications are twofold. One is to make it more difficult to create historic districts, and then also to protect property rights. Again, I would argue that we only have 78 districts statewide, and we haven't created a new district in Grand Rapids in the past 2 decades. So they're not easy to create already, and we don't know if it's necessary to create a higher bar to create a historic district. The other piece is, which I just forgot I was going to say.
Well, it really seems like this bill, and luckily Representative Afandoulis is working with you on it and other historic preservation people, so obviously he is listening. But it really seems like this bill, coming from Representative Afandoulis, who doesn't represent any historic communities, is sort of a solution without a problem.
That has been repeated. If you look at the Free Press, there's been editorials. There's been a lot of comment made about that, about whether what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And again, I think I come from it the perspective of we've had this policy, this law in place for over 4 decades, and it's been very effective at really no public cost and huge benefit as far as property values. Investment, being able to maintain a community and having that return on investment that people come to expect, whether it's an equity as a homeowner or as a landlord and rent. I think the debate about whether or not somebody should be able to put, if it's as basic as any property owner should be able to put vinyl windows in, well, then maybe they shouldn't buy in a historic district. I mean, there's that choice too, that what you're getting. It's just like that brand I mentioned in a historic district. And it does come with additional rules, but I would also argue it comes with additional benefits that you don't necessarily see in other neighborhoods.
Everything you said is great information. I really want to thank you for taking the time to kind of explain it to me and our listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great fun.
So before I end this episode, I want to share the Rental Property Owner Association's official position on the Historic District Modernization Act, which, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing here, comes down to the RPOA is neutral. But they do express concern for current property owners in historic districts who have invested the time and money required to maintain their property to the historic district standards, and then due to the loss or weakening of these standards might not realize the return on investment that they were expecting. For my part, I like owning property in Heritage Hill, which is a historic district, because I have more renters who want to live there. So I get higher rents, the cap rates are lower, which means that the value of my properties are higher, and the appreciation that I've seen over the period that I've owned in Heritage Hill has been better than anything anywhere else. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next Monday.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.